Peter Rahbar, welcome to the conversation today.
Glad to be here, John. Thanks for having me.
It is a pleasure. You're joining us from New York. I'm south of Salt Lake City in Utah. And today we're going to be talking about why transparency from the top down is so important to company morale. This is a topic I love. I spend a lot of time thinking about this. It's a common problem. I see it in most organizations. And it's one of those things that I just feel like it's largely an avoidable issue. Yet it's one that so many organizations and so many leaders face. And so we're going to unpack all that and try to understand better how we can go about proactively creating a culture of openness, transparency to develop trust and really help everyone feel seen and heard and have an opportunity to contribute. As we get started, I wanted to share Peter's bio with everybody. Peter Rahbar is a workplace legal expert who guides clients through the most important decisions of their professional lives. After almost 20 years of representing major international corporations and various clients in high-profile matters, including over a decade as chief employment attorney for a major global media company, Peter founded the Rahbar Group, a boutique employment law practice based in New York City. Peter specializes in representing individuals, including C-suite executives, media personalities, and other professionals working in finance, media, sports, real estate, fashion, and tech. I could say way more about Peter's background, but I'm going to stop there. Peter, anything you'd like to highlight by way of your background and personal context before we dive on in?
No, I think that was a pretty comprehensive description. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay, well, great. Let's dive on in then and just start with the why behind transparency. Why is this important? And maybe even before we get there, perhaps it's worth even taking a step back and thinking historically about transparency issues. From my perspective and from what I've studied, it seems like there's been a relatively significant shift in recent decades towards more openness, more transparency. Whereas, in previous generations, in the workplace, perhaps that wasn't even an expectation of employees to the extent it is today. Is that consistent with your understanding and with your experience?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a really timely broadcast moment we're having here. We are recording this during a week where, war has broken out in the Middle East. We have college campuses and workplaces, battling with issues about how to communicate. And so what is one thing that this shows to us, and really it highlights this issue that you bring up of like what employees are expecting from their managers and corporate executives when things happen, not just in the workplace, but in society. And so they want to hear from their bosses. They want to hear from their executives and leaders. And, frankly, from my viewpoint, leaders are paid to communicate and have dialogues with employees and tackle difficult issues. We have a dynamic where for years, including through the pandemic, companies have said, give us all your time, give us all your commitment. And frankly, employees have been getting less and less back from their companies in terms of, pensions, retirement benefits, career training, etc. And now coming out of the crisis portion of the pandemic, we see employees really demanding so much more from their employers and having a lot more power and exercising that in many different ways. And so what we have here, we're at a moment right now where employee expectations of their companies and their leaders are very high. And we have employers and managers who are struggling to find the right way to meet it. And for me, when I discuss these issues with executives who I represent and work with, the key issue as we talk about is trust. How do you build trust? One important way to do that is communicate. And they're struggling with how to communicate, how often to communicate, what to communicate, what employees want to hear or don't want to hear. And my advice is always on the side of like over communicating and not just about good things. about difficult things too.
Yeah, well, I completely agree. I think if you're going to err on the side of over communication, and it's interesting though. So as you think about individuals who are in leadership roles, I think part of the challenge that organizations are facing and that leaders are facing is that there's a generational disconnect. So we mentioned how things have shifted, expectations, in the aggregate have shifted over the decades. The psychological contract between employer and employee has shifted over the decades. And so if you have someone who has a really great track record of experience for decades in the industry, in the organization, they may have very well come up at a time where communication, transparency just wasn't, it wasn't the expectation, it wasn't the norm. And I think a lot of leaders think they're being transparent. They think that they're communicating. They may even think they're over communicating. But in my experience, most of the time, most of their people feel like they're still lacking a ton of information and they feel frustrated by it. And like you said, this really impacts trust, because if members of your team feel like you're not being transparent with them, whether that's right or wrong, if that's the perception, then it erodes trust, and people start to fill in the gaps mentally with areas where they don't have information that they think is important. And a lot of times, if you have people filling in the gaps themselves, it's not going to be in your favor. They're usually going to be coming up with nefarious intentions or conspiracy theories or like other negative things that are often way more negative than the reality. But it's kind of human nature, and water cooler talk and gossiping and all those things, people fill in the gaps. And so trying to find ways to open up your communication is always a challenge, I think, for everybody, but especially if you came up in a day when it just wasn't as much the norm. I think the mindset shift can be really challenging. And again, I think there are lots of leaders with really good intentions who think they are communicating very transparently, who even think that they're over communicating, and they're just not in alignment with the expectations of their people.
You make a lot of good points there. I mean, and I'll say, very simply, there's a lot of leaders who are refusing to update their playbooks. And in 2023, that's a very dangerous strategy. Sure, things have worked over time. And I'm not saying change everything about how you manage and lead, but you have to be open to change. And you have to understand, some of the things that you very astutely pointed out there, that, there are, I think right now, 4 or 5 different generations in the workplace simultaneously. That's very tricky. That's very difficult. The youngest generation in particular poses challenges that we've never seen before. They have access to information that no generation of employees has ever had. And they're very open with sharing information, not only about the company and what the company is or isn't doing, but also about their own personal work situations. I mean, just think about that for a second. I'm Gen X, the squashed generation. We never talked about salary. When I started a law firm, our numbers were published in different law trades covering the industry, but we never talked about individual salary or bonus situations with our colleagues. This newest generation, they talk about everything, and it includes salaries. They have spreadsheets. They have sites where they share this information. There are websites dedicated to providing that information to them. We have sources such as Glassdoor and others where employers are in real time held accountable for what they do, sometimes unfairly. I would say a lot of times unfairly, but sometimes fairly. And so as a leader, you have to adapt to this. You have to adapt to the fact that your employees have almost equal access to information as you. So what are you going to do? Are you going to let them, as you say, are you going to let them just use it and form their own conclusions? Or are you going to shape your own narrative? And you really have to use every opportunity possible to shape your narrative. So whether it's putting out a communication or holding out an all hands meeting or responding to a crisis, whether it's local or regional or international, or even in one-to-one employee meetings regarding performance or terminating an employee or how you treat an employee when you terminate. All of these are moments where you're communicating not just with that one employee, but with all of your employees. You're sending a message. This is how we value you or don't value you in some cases. These are the values the company has and believes in. And we stand by them, and as I said, it's not always going to be easy. And employees just, they don't want to hear only about the good things. They want to hear about the difficult things too. And they're willing to accept difficult news. And so over the past couple of years, we've talked about, what are the downsides of communicating a unpopular return to work policy or something like that, right? And my answer has always been, if you've involved employees in the process, you've heard their concerns, you've considered them, you've balanced them against your business needs and how you do business, then whatever outcome you come out with, they're going to understand it. As long as you explain it and it has a rationale and they had a part of the process. So these moments come up every day, every minute now for companies, and it hasn't been this way because they've always had control. They've always had control of the message. They've had control over the information. That just doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, and I think some are under the illusion that they still have control. And in some cases they do to some extent, because if they but here's the issue. If they do still have control, it's only because they're hoarding, like they're becoming gatekeepers of information, hoarding information. And that is like the worst case scenario in terms of negatively impacting trust and morale and people, attributing a nefarious intent towards, a given leader. It's just not the world we're in today. To your point, any younger person just about, has not only the skill set and access to a wide variety of information, but their kind of baseline expectation level about how communication will occur and how they interact with their leaders has shifted. And so power via information control, in my opinion, is just not a great strategy in today. Like
No.
it may have been a viable strategy, decades ago, but I just don't think in most cases that's going to be a viable strategy, and you're going to ultimately undermine your own influence because you're going to erode trust. And again, as I think about younger people, younger members of the workforce, sometimes they get, the rap of kind of being the entitled generation, or they're not willing to put in the, grind and put in the work and pay the dues that older generations may have had to do or felt like they had to do in the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, there could be some truth to that, but largely, I'm a university professor in addition to doing consulting work and going out and working with organizations. And largely I'll tell my students, these are the types of organizations you want to work for. These are the types of organizations or the types of leaders that are going to be effective. We talk about healthy organizations, and we talk about toxic leadership, and we talk about, the types of things that will help organizations run more effectively and teams run more effectively. And so I would like to think at least some of this entitlement is really just a generation or two of workers who've gone through their educational system with a different playbook. They just understand, like, these are best practices. These are the types of things that should happen. And when they don't happen, they're holding their leaders accountable. Whereas previous generations, a lot of times were just like, well, what am I going to do? So you just kind of deal with it. And the younger generation is just like, no, I'm not dealing with that. I'll go to a different place. And there's enough fluidity in the job market and enough demand for labor and enough of a shortage that, that has worked for them just fine.
Yeah, the entitlement argument drives me crazy. And I hear that all the time. I mean, every cocktail party I'm at, with executives, or I was just at a conference, a tech conference last week, where it came up a lot. Look, I worked with a lot of entitled people too when I entered the workforce 30 years ago. I can tell you exactly, what they said, and you'd be shocked how similar they are to what people are saying now. I mean, we used to mock the lawyers who would walk in day one and say, I want to appear in court, and I deserve to do the deposition or whatever. And there were people like me and others who were sitting at their desk reviewing thousands of boxes and documents, because that's what first year lawyers do at big law firms. The same issues exist. It's just, how do you manage people like that? And yeah, these people have more outlets for their frustrations and views, so they're more vocal about it, right? I mean, when I entered the workforce, we didn't have social media, so the entitlement was limited to the office mates and the water coolers and the cocktail parties. Now it's blasted over social media, or different websites criticizing companies, and yeah, you have to adjust to it. This is your workforce, so you have to adjust to it. And
I mean, the reality is, it doesn't matter if they're entitled or not, because it's the reality. So we got to figure out how we're going to work within this reality effectively, or we're going to become irrelevant, and we're not going to be able to attract and retain good people from these generations of younger workers. So again,
and language.
Go ahead.
Language is very important. I mean, for a leader to be making a statement like that, particularly publicly, I think is viewed as very disrespectful to employees, as it should be. I mean, yesterday or 2 days ago, Steve Schwartzman at a conference in Saudi Arabia said people don't, quote, grind as hard when they work remotely. I mean, for the people in his company at his firm who've worked remotely and worked really hard and probably worked nonstop all night, that's got to be pretty dispiriting to hear something like that. And like you said, in 2023, what are people going to do? They're not just going to like put their head down and keep working. They're going to look at other jobs. They're going to pick up the phone when the recruiter calls. They're going to go update their LinkedIn profile and turn on the button that, tells recruiters they're looking for jobs. There's things they can do. They don't have to sit there, and that's what frustrates the employers. Like, if they were really being honest, they would say, I'm frustrated that these entitled people just don't sit down and do whatever I tell them to do. That they pick up and move somewhere else. And maybe that, and for an employee, that's your test, right? Like, if you're as good as you say you are, is there another job for you? Is there someone who believes that? If when clients come to me and say, well, I want to have this big conversation about salary, I tell them, well, are you prepared to go somewhere else if it doesn't work out? Because, some managers may respond in that way and say, well, if you can get X, go get it. I'm not going to stop you. But the stigma of leaving a job or quitting or, taking a stand is gone, just totally gone.
Yep. Absolutely. You mentioned something a few minutes ago I wanted to zoom in on a little bit, and that is how transparency plays a part in employee voice. And I think that's part of the DEI conversation. So if we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging within the workplace, and trying to strive for that equality and equity in the workplace, and to really understand your people, to understand their needs, of course you would need to be listening, but what's the role of openness and transparency from the top down in creating that kind of a workplace and environment where you have the potential of actually better understanding your employees' needs?
Well, employees want to be treated fairly and respectfully, and they value diversity of workforce, diversity of opinions, and they want their companies to have actual values in how they conduct their day-to-day business. And so, it's important for employers to communicate that whenever they can. They should have a regular cadence for doing that, but they should also take any opportunity to communicate that where it exists. And we're in a time now where a lot of DEI programs are under legal challenges post the Supreme Court's affirmative action decision last year. And some companies are, I would say, like, hiding in the corner and hoping they don't get, called out and And others are very affirmatively saying, hey, this is what we stand for. And one of the things we stand for is having, diverse representation in our workforce. And I think it's an important time. If that's what you believe, I think it's an important time for you to articulate that as often as possible. And I think it's also an important time to not, back down in the face of challenges, from some of these groups that are going after, law firms and other programs with diversity, recruiting or other efforts. And then I would say it's also comes out, and it should be reflected in what you do as a company, like your actions. So, like if you believe in diversity and you're being challenged on your recruiting practices, well, change your recruiting practices in ways that will be compliant with the law. Start recruiting at different schools. Start, changing your job descriptions. Start changing your job requirements, to help bring in different candidates and a more diverse talent pool. So there's a lot of different ways to go about it, but communication sort of is the common thread through all of it. And having a dialogue is really important, and creating an environment where people feel safe having a dialogue with you is really important. It takes time and a lot of effort to establish that. It doesn't just happen overnight.
Yeah, it doesn't happen overnight. It's not a magical thing. It's not a one-off. I think that's sometimes where leaders fall into the trap of thinking, hey, I sent an email or I mentioned it in this all hands meeting, so we should be good. I'm like, no, you can't just, things that are core values that influence a whole range of policies, practices, and procedures can't be a one-off. Like, it has to be a constant part of the narrative and the dialogue that's occurring. And you mentioned it just a minute ago. The role of transparency and communication is that it develops trust, and it creates an environment of psychological safety where other people feel like they can voice concerns. So if there isn't openness and communication, if there isn't transparency from the top down, if you think you're just going to have people come forward and voice, and push back and voice their concerns around issues related to DEIB stuff, or just, it doesn't even have to fall into a category of diversity. It just my needs. I'm a straight cisgender white dude. I don't really tick any of the diversity boxes, but I still have unique needs. My family has unique circumstances. And so it's nice to know when I work with an organization or for a leader that I can have those conversations with them when something comes up, or I need some sort of an accommodation or something like that. And if you have a closed system without much communication, without really any transparency, typically you're not going to be getting that kind of communication upline, which means you're not going to probably be doing, unless you get super lucky, you're not going to be doing very well with your diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts.
Right. And some of it's just purely mechanical. Like, are you providing real channels for employees to have a voice? Do they have input on major decisions? Do they have representatives who can raise issues? Do you have a good HR team that, is providing a safe environment for employees to come forward? Do you have hotlines they can call? Do you have mental health support? I mean, that's an area right now that I would say a lot of companies are just failing and flailing on how to address, but it's so important, right? I mean, and it is something that employees are afraid to talk about and raise to their employers. Many, not all. So you don't want to miss these opportunities with your employees, which means you need to provide them with the channels to raise these issues. You need to give them a real voice. If HR is supposed to be that voice and that channel for employees, then let's make sure that HR is really acting in that way and not just viewed as, another arm of management enforcement, which is I think, unfortunately, the sort of de facto view that most people have of or default view that most people have of HR. So, are you having one-on-ones regularly? Are you having small group meetings? Are you having all hands? Like, these are all things that employers should be doing all the time. And yeah, it takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of time. There's no direct line item in the balance sheet for it, but trust me, it has there's studies that show the impact of improving workplace morale and addressing mental health issues and addressing physical health issues, and and improving diversity and all of these elements.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has just been a really great conversation, Peter. Thank you so much for your time. I note the time and I need to let you go here in just a minute, but before we wrap up, I wanted to give you a chance to share with the audience how they can connect with you, find out more about your work, your team, and then give us a final word on the topic for today.
Sure. Well, I really enjoyed being here with you, or being connected with you from New York and Utah. I can be found on my website, therahbargroup.com, on my LinkedIn profile, which is under my name, Peter Rahbar. And you'll reach out, and I'd love to chat. I deal with these issues exclusively: employment law, workplace issues. That's all I do. And I think my parting note is, if you're a leader of an organization right now, these times that we're going through right now, this is why you're being paid the big bucks. Make the difficult decisions, do the right thing for your company. Think about the impact on your employees of acting or not acting. But really, it's time to be bold. It's time to be assertive. It's time to show, why you're in the position you're in. And if you're not willing to do it, then it's time to pass the gavel on or the leadership baton to someone who is, because that's what employers are looking for. They're looking for leadership. Believe it or not, that's what they want.
Yeah, absolutely. Peter, thank you again. It's been a real pleasure. I encourage the audience to reach out, get connected, find out more about what Peter and his team can do for you. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe, that you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you all have